I left my husband at 74 after he lost his construction company. You're a broke loser, I shouted. He silently nodded. A year later, his lawyer called me. Your ex-husband died yesterday. Before his death, he wanted you to know one thing. What he said made me go pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think a long marriage was proof of something. 49 years with Donald Collins. That had to mean we knew each other. That had to mean something solid, something real. Looking back now from the distance of grief and shame, I understand that I confused duration with depth. I mistook familiarity for truth. We lived in the same house in Millbrook, Ohio for 31 years, a colonial with a wraparound porch on Sycamore Drive. Donald had built it himself. Well, his crew had, back when Collins and Sons Construction was something to be proud of. In those days, Donald's name meant something in our county. He'd shake hands at the hardware store and men would nod with respect. I liked that. I won't pretend I didn't. I retired from teaching 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary in 2012. After that, my days had a pleasant, unhurried shape. Morning coffee on the porch, a book club on Tuesdays, the garden in summer. Donald still went to the office every day. That was his nature. He wasn't the kind of man who could sit still. Even at 76, he was up at 6, dressed by 6:30, out the door before I'd finished my first cup. I should tell you about Cheryl. Donald's younger sister had always been a presence in our marriage. Not always welcome, but always there. She was 68, sharp-tongued, and had worked in the company's accounting office for over 20 years. Donald trusted her completely. I never did. There was something in the way she'd look at me sometimes, a flicker of calculation behind her smile, that I could never quite name. I told Donald once, early in our marriage, that I didn't entirely trust his sister. He laughed and said I was imagining things. After that, I stopped saying it out loud, but I never stopped feeling it. The first sign came in the spring of 2022. Donald had always handled our finances. That had been our arrangement since 1974, and I'd been comfortable with it. But that March, a letter arrived from our bank while Donald was at the office. I wasn't in the habit of opening his mail. I set it on his desk and forgot about it. That evening, he came home and went straight to his study without saying hello. The door closed. I heard him on the phone, his voice low and tight in a way I hadn't heard before. I asked him about it at dinner. He said it was nothing, a vendor dispute. I believed him. The second sign came in May. Our neighbors, the Pattersons, mentioned casually that they'd heard Collins and Sons had lost the Ridgemont School contract, a major municipal job Donald had been counting on. I hadn't known he was counting on anything. When I asked Donald, he said the Pattersons were gossips and changed the subject. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. I had no reason not to believe him, but I began to notice smaller things. The way he paused before answering simple questions. The way he stopped mentioning specific projects at dinner, where once he'd talked about work constantly. The way Cheryl had started calling the house in the evenings, something she'd never done before. And how Donald would take those calls in the hallway, standing with his back to me. By August, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what or how bad. Then came September, and I found out along with everyone else. The news wasn't delivered to me privately or gently. I read it in the local paper, a small item on page 4 of the Millbrook Gazette. Collins and Sons Construction had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Debts exceeding $2.3 million. Assets insufficient to cover obligations. The company, founded in 1981, was to be liquidated. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper in my hands for a long time. When Donald came home that evening, I was still sitting there. He walked in, saw my face, and stopped in the doorway. He looked old. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. I don't know exactly what I had expected from myself in that moment. Compassion, perhaps. Patience. 49 years should have built something capable of surviving a crisis. But what came out of me wasn't compassion. It was fear dressed up as rage, and it landed on him like a blow. "You're a ruined failure, Donald," I heard myself say. My voice was louder than I'd intended. It filled the kitchen. A ruined, broken failure. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply looked at me with those pale gray eyes of his, and he nodded once, slowly, quietly, as if I had confirmed something he already believed about himself. That nod. I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand that nod. I left the following week. I want to be precise about that because it matters. Not to excuse myself, but to be honest. I did not leave in a moment of passion. I had 7 days after that scene in the kitchen. 7 days in which Donald and I moved around each other like strangers in a waiting room, and I chose to leave. That distinction has kept me awake more nights than I can count. I went to stay with my daughter, Carol, in Columbus. She was 51, divorced, with a guest room, and the particular wariness of a woman who had watched her parents' marriage from the inside for decades. She didn't say, "I told you so." She made up the bed with clean sheets and put a glass of water on the nightstand, and didn't ask me anything that first night. For that, I will always be grateful to her. But in the morning, she asked. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much. The bankruptcy. The letter from the bank I'd never opened. The phone calls with Cheryl. The Ridgemont contract. The silence that had expanded between Donald and me over months until it had become the primary atmosphere of our house. "Do you know what you actually lost?" Carol asked. She wasn't being cruel. She's an accountant. She thinks in terms of what can be quantified. I didn't know. That was the humiliating truth. I had been married to this man for 49 years, and I didn't know what we owned, what we owed, or what, if anything, remained. We spent that afternoon going through what I had brought with me. Bank statements I'd thought to grab from the filing cabinet, the deed to the house, Donald's last 2 tax returns, which I had signed without reading. Carol sat across from me at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and went through everything methodically. The house had a $180,000 home equity line of credit on it. I hadn't known. Our joint savings account held $14,200. There were 2 credit cards in both our names with a combined balance of $23,000. I was 74 years old, and I had $14,200 and a house I might lose. The fear I felt then was different from the fear I'd felt in the kitchen. That had been a hot, sudden thing. This was cold and slow, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. But fear, I have learned, can do 2 things to a person. It can paralyze, or it can clarify. Somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday of that first week in Carol's guest room, something shifted in me. I stopped lying in the dark cataloging disasters and started asking a different question. Not what happened to us, but how did it happen? Not why didn't Donald tell me, but what exactly didn't he tell me, and why? Because there was something that didn't add up. I had been a teacher for 38 years. I understood institutional failure, budget shortfalls, administrative incompetence, decisions made badly over time. But Collins and Sons had been profitable for decades. Donald was not a reckless man. He was methodical, careful, almost excessively cautious. He didn't gamble. He didn't speculate. He didn't make impulsive decisions. A company like his didn't simply collapse, not without help. And then I thought of Cheryl. The evening phone calls, the 20 years in the accounting office, the way she'd looked at me across Donald's hospital bed when he'd had his hip replaced 3 years ago. A look I'd dismissed at the time as exhaustion, but which now, with this new cold clarity, I reread differently. My first plan was simple and perhaps naive, but it was mine. I was going to find out what had really happened to Collins and Sons Construction. I was going to get copies of every financial document I was legally entitled to as Donald's wife. I was going to find out who had made which decisions and when, and if what I suspected, still only a shadow of a suspicion, turned out to be true, I was going to do something about it. I called a lawyer on Thursday morning. Not a divorce lawyer. Not yet. A general practice attorney named Ruth Vasquez, whom Carol knew through work and trusted. I made an appointment for the following Monday. Then I called my friend Eleanor, who had worked for the county court clerk's office for 22 years before retiring, and I asked her to have coffee with me. I told her I needed to understand what public records I could access related to a business bankruptcy filing. Eleanor didn't ask why. She just said, Tuesday at 10, bring a notebook. I brought two. Ruth Vasquez's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a directness I found immediately reassuring. She didn't treat me like a confused elderly woman. She treated me like a client. I laid out what I knew. She listened without interrupting, made notes, and then asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Was I still legally married? Yes, I had left the house, but we had filed nothing. Was my name on the business? No. Collins & Sons had always been solely in Donald's name, though I had occasionally signed documents over the years as a witness or guarantor. Did I know the name of the bankruptcy trustee? I did not, but Eleanor had told me how to find it. Ruth explained what Chapter 7 meant in practical terms. The bankruptcy trustee would be liquidating all business assets. As Donald's spouse, I had certain rights regarding marital assets, including the house, which was jointly owned. But those rights would need to be actively asserted. She recommended I not finalize any separation agreement until the bankruptcy proceedings were further along. She also recommended I request, as Donald's legal spouse, copies of the bankruptcy filing documents. There's something else, I said. I told her about Cheryl, about the phone calls, about the accounting office, about the sense I couldn't shake that this hadn't been simply a business failure. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if there was any financial misconduct by an employee, embezzlement, fraud, falsification of records, the bankruptcy trustee would want to know, and so would the IRS. She gave me the trustee's name, a man named Gerald Park, appointed by the federal bankruptcy court. She advised me to contact him directly and request the full schedule of assets and liabilities as filed. I did that the next morning from Carol's kitchen table. Eleanor, true to her word, met me on Tuesday with a folder of printed information about public records access. Business bankruptcy filings in Ohio are federal court records, available through the federal court's online database. Eleanor walked me through it slowly, step by step, until I could navigate it myself. I am not a woman who fears technology, but I had never used a federal court database before. By the end of that session, I had printed 47 pages of documents. I took them home and read every word. The debt structure was strange. I saw it even as a layperson. There were 3 large vendor accounts, totaling nearly $900,000, that had been paid out in lump sums over the previous 18 months to companies I didn't recognize. The names were generic: Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, Great Lakes Building Resources, Inc., Consolidated Project Management Group. I wrote them all down. I called Eleanor that evening. Can you find out if those companies are real? I asked. Registered with the state, I mean, active businesses. I can look them up in the Ohio Secretary of State's database, she said. That's public. She called me back the following morning. 2 of the 3 companies had been registered within the previous 2 years. Both had the same registered agent, a name neither of us recognized. The 3rd company, Consolidated Project Management Group, had been dissolved just 4 months ago. All 3 had the same address, a UPS store and a strip mall in Westerville. I sat with that information for a long time. Shell companies. Money paid out to shell companies from Collins & Sons over 18 months, totaling nearly $900,000. And the person who had managed the company's accounting for 20 years was Cheryl Collins. I hadn't wanted to believe it, even as I'd suspected it. There's a difference between suspecting something terrible and having it confirmed in black and white on a printed page. My hands were steady as I held the papers, but something inside me had gone very quiet and very cold. It was Carol who said what I hadn't yet said aloud. "Mom," she said, standing in the doorway of the guest room, looking at the papers spread across the bed. "Did Cheryl steal from the company?" "I think she stole nearly $1 million, I said. "And I think your father knew. And I think he didn't tell me because he was trying to protect her, or protect me from it, or both. And I think that silence cost him everything." That was the moment I understood that I hadn't left a failed man. I had left a man who had been betrayed, and then betrayed again by my cruelty, in the worst moment of his life. The point of no return, they call it. I had passed mine. There was no undoing what I'd said in that kitchen. But there might be something I could still do. Ruth had advised me to bring the documents to her before doing anything else. I did that on Wednesday afternoon. Drove the 40 minutes to her office myself, with the printed pages in a manila folder on the passenger seat and Eleanor's notes folded inside. Ruth read everything carefully, then made copies. "This is enough to refer to the trustee," she said. "Gerald Park has an obligation to investigate any indication of pre-bankruptcy fraud. If these companies are shells and the transfers were fraudulent, that money could potentially be recovered for the creditors. And depending on what's found, there could be criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office." "What about Donald?" I asked. Ruth was careful. "If he knew about the transfers and authorized them without understanding they were fraudulent, he may be a victim. If he participated knowingly—" She paused. "That's for the investigation to determine." I knew Donald. He had authorized those payments because his sister had told him to, had presented him with paperwork he trusted her to have verified. He was methodical, not forensic. He would not have checked whether Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, was a real company. Why would he? Cheryl was family. I authorized Ruth to contact Gerald Park's office. She sent the referral that afternoon. I had not anticipated how quickly Cheryl would find out. I don't know to this day how she learned. Whether someone in the trustee's office was less than discreet, or whether she had contacts who kept watch, or whether she simply knew with the instinct of someone who has been waiting for consequence to arrive. But 2 days later, on a Friday morning, my cell phone rang with a number I recognized. I had not heard from Cheryl since before I left Donald. I let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. Then she called Carol's landline. Carol came to the guest room doorway. "It's Donald's sister," she said. Her voice was flat. I took the phone. "Margaret." Cheryl's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. A high, thin tension, like a wire pulled too tight. "I think we need to talk, in person." "I don't think we do," I said. "You have made a very serious mistake," she said. "What you've handed to that trustee, those are internal business documents. You don't understand what you're looking at. You're going to cause enormous damage to this family based on a misunderstanding." "Then the trustee will find that out," I said. A pause. "Margaret, think very carefully. You are 74 years old. You are in the middle of a bankruptcy that affects your home. You don't have resources for a prolonged legal fight. And if you persist in making false accusations against me, I will be forced to pursue defamation." There it was, the threat, clean and direct. I had expected fear. I felt something closer to confirmation. Innocent people don't threaten defamation suits in response to financial records. "Cheryl," I said, "I didn't make any accusations. I sent documents to a court-appointed trustee, that's all. If there's nothing to find, there's nothing to worry about." She hung up. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed for a few minutes, then called Ruth and told her about the call. Ruth noted it and said I should document the time, date, and content. She said if Cheryl contacted me again in a threatening manner, it could be relevant. Then something unexpected happened. I cried, not from fear, or not only from fear, from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of the past weeks, from the image of Donald nodding in the kitchen doorway, from the knowledge that somewhere across town, my husband of 49 years was alone in our house on Sycamore Drive, while his sister had picked through his life's work like a crow. I took 4 days. Carol didn't push. I slept. I sat on her back porch in the October air and watched the leaves come down. I called my friend Barbara in Millbrook, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. Her grandchildren, a television show, the price of groceries. Normal things. I needed the texture of normal things. On the 5th day, I woke up at 6, made coffee, and sat down at Carol's kitchen table. I was ready to continue. The attempt at seduction, for that is what it was, dressed in the language of family concern, came through an intermediary. Donald's nephew, Brian, Cheryl's son, appeared at Carol's door on a Tuesday evening. He was 43, good-looking in an effortful way, and he had always treated me with the careful deference men use toward elderly relatives they consider irrelevant. He held a casserole dish covered in foil and wore an expression of practiced sorrow. "Aunt Peggy," he said, "Mom wanted to make sure you were eating." Carol stood behind me in the doorway. I could feel her stillness. "That's thoughtful," I said. I did not move aside to let him in. Brian shifted. "She's very worried about you, about all of this. She thinks, and I think, that this situation has gotten out of hand. That maybe there are things you don't fully understand about how the company worked, about the pressures Dad, Uncle Don, was under." He stumbled on the names, which told me he'd rehearsed this and was losing his footing. "Brian," I said, "I appreciate you coming. Please tell your mother I'm fine." "The thing is," he said, lowering his voice, "if this goes further, the trustee, the investigation, it could get very complicated, for you too. You signed some documents over the years, as a co-signatory. Your name is on things." He let that sit for a moment. "Mom just wants to make sure you don't end up caught in something that wasn't your doing." There it was, softer than the phone call, but carrying the same blade. "Your name is on things." An implication, not quite a threat. An invitation to be afraid. I looked at him for a moment. He had Cheryl's eyes, quick, assessing, always calculating the distance between what was said and what was meant. "Good night, Brian," I said. I closed the door. Carol exhaled behind me. "That was a threat." "Yes," I said, "a polite one." I called Ruth the next morning and told her. She confirmed that as Donald's spouse, I had occasionally witnessed or co-signed routine business documents, but that a co-signatory on standard vendor contracts carried no meaningful liability for fraud committed by an accounting officer. She said she'd document Brian's visit and the implied warning. "They're scared," Ruth said. "I know," I said. And I felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't fear or grief. Something steadier. Call it clarity. But I knew I couldn't sustain this alone on clarity alone. I needed people around me who understood not just the legal mechanics, but the human weight of what I was carrying. I called Eleanor. I told her everything. The shell companies, Cheryl's call, Brian's visit, the casserole I'd left on Carol's counter. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need to talk to Janet Myers." Janet Myers was a woman Eleanor had known for years. A retired social worker, 70 years old, who had spent decades helping older women navigate exactly the kind of terrain I was standing on. Financial abuse, family coercion, the particular cruelty of people who target those they think won't fight back. I met Janet the following Thursday at a coffee shop on the east side of Columbus. She was a compact woman with cropped silver hair and a quality of attention that reminded me of the best teachers I'd known. Not busy, not performing interest, but genuinely present. I talked for an hour. She listened, asked precise questions, and then said something I needed to hear. "What you're describing is a pattern," she said. "Cheryl didn't steal from a business. She stole from a family. She used her position of trust, and she counted on Donald's loyalty to her to keep it buried, and she counted on your trust in Donald to keep you from looking too closely. And now she's counting on your fear of conflict, and your age, and your isolation to keep you quiet." She paused. "How's that working out for her?" I almost smiled. Janet connected me with a support group that met weekly in Columbus. Women, mostly older, navigating elder financial abuse and family legal disputes. I went the following Monday. I didn't say much. I listened. But for the first time since I'd sat at Donald's kitchen table with a newspaper in my hands, I didn't feel alone. That mattered more than I had words for. Cheryl was watching. I had no doubt of that. Brian's visit had been reconnaissance as much as anything else. They were waiting to see if the casserole and the quiet threat had been enough. They had not been enough. She came herself on a Saturday morning in November. I had returned to Millbrook by then. Not to the house on Sycamore Drive, but to Barbara's spare room on the other side of town. Barbara was 71, widowed, a practical woman who made good coffee and asked few unnecessary questions. Being back in Millbrook felt strange, like returning to the scene of something I hadn't yet finished understanding. I drove past Sycamore Drive once, without meaning to. Took a wrong turn in the familiar streets of my own town, which told me something about the state I was in. The Colonial looked the same from the outside. The porch swing where I'd drunk coffee for 30 years. The maple in the front yard that Donald had planted the year Carol was born. I drove past without stopping. Cheryl knocked at Barbara's door at 10 in the morning. She was dressed carefully, a dark coat, low heels, her gray hair set. She carried nothing. No casserole, no intermediary. She had come to do this herself. Barbara opened the door, looked at her, and looked at me across the living room. I nodded. Barbara stepped back and let her in, but did not leave the room. She sat down in her armchair by the window with a cup of coffee and a paperback, and she read, or appeared to read, while Cheryl and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "I'm not here to argue," Cheryl said. Her voice was the voice she used when she wanted to appear reasonable, measured, almost warm. I had heard it at holiday tables for 49 years. "I'm here because I'm genuinely worried about you, Margaret. About what this is doing to you. You've been through an enormous shock. Donald's business failing, leaving your home. That's traumatic for anyone. And sometimes when we're in that state, we look for someone to blame." "I'm not looking for someone to blame," I said. "I sent financial documents to a court trustee." "Those documents were incomplete," she said. "You saw numbers without context, without understanding how construction accounting works, the advance payments, the subcontractor structures. Those companies you flagged, they were legitimate vendors. Small, yes. Unconventional in their setup, but legitimate." "The UPS store address," I said. A flicker crossed her face. So brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching so carefully. "A registered agent address. That's completely standard for small LLCs. All three of them, the same registered agent, registered within the past 2 years, paid nearly $1 million. "Margaret." She leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry about what happened with the company. But what you're doing, bringing outside investigators into a family matter, is going to hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. Donald's name, his legacy, what his sons remember about him." She paused. Then, softer. "You spent 49 years building something together. Don't let bitterness erase that. Don't let this be how people remember the Collins family." She placed her hand briefly on the table between us, not touching mine, but close. An offer, performed. "There's still time to step back. No one would blame you. You've been through enough." I recognized the move for what it was, an appeal to the woman she believed I still was, the one who deferred, who preserved, who smoothed things over to keep the peace. She had known me for 49 years. She thought she knew what I would do. "What Carol will think," she continued, "when all of this is examined and people start asking what you knew and when." There was the real threat, stated finally without a veil. Carol, your daughter, her name. She was expanding the blast radius, making it personal, making it about protecting my child. My hands were flat on the table. I felt them as if from a slight distance. "Cheryl," I said, "I've been married to your brother for 49 years. I know what family loyalty means to him. I understand why he protected you. I think he protected you right up until he couldn't anymore, and I think that cost him more than the company." I paused. "But I am not Donald. I don't have his particular kind of loyalty. And Carol is an accountant. She's seen the same documents I have. So that particular argument won't work on either of us. The warmth went out of Cheryl's face. You are making a very serious mistake, she said. Her voice had changed. Flatter now, the civility stripped back. I have resources you don't have. I have documentation that can complicate your position considerably. If you think this ends with you being the wronged party, you are badly mistaken. Then we'll let the trustees sort it out, I said. She stood, buttoned her coat, looked at me for a moment with something I can only describe as contempt. Not for me specifically, I thought, but for the situation, for the fact that it had come to this, for the inconvenient stubbornness of a 74-year-old woman who should, by any reasonable calculation, have been easier to manage than this. She left without saying goodbye to Barbara. Barbara set down her paperback. Well, she said. Yes, I said. I went to the guest room and sat on the bed. My heart was beating faster than usual. I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't afraid. I was. Cheryl was not an unintelligent woman, and she'd had months to prepare while I'd had weeks. She had said she had documentation that could complicate my position. I didn't know what that meant, and not knowing was the most frightening part. I thought about Donald, about the fact that he had sat across from Cheryl in a room somewhere in July, and believed her when she told him the money could be returned quietly. He had been afraid too, afraid of what the truth would cost her, cost the family, cost the idea of what the Collins name meant in this town. Fear had made him choose silence. I had seen where that led. My fear was telling me the same things his fear had told him. Step back, stay quiet, let it go. And I understood, sitting on that bed in Barbara's guest room with November light coming through the curtain, that this was exactly the moment that mattered. Not the dramatic ones. Not the scene in the kitchen, not the grocery store confrontation yet to come. This quiet, private moment. This choice. I called Ruth on Monday morning and reported the visit in full. Good, Ruth said. Keep documenting everything. She said she has documentation that could complicate my position, I said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Let her play that card. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. But right now, the trustees' investigation is moving forward. Gerald Park's office has been in contact with the Ohio Secretary of State and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I repeated that back. The FBI. This is federal bankruptcy fraud, Margaret. If those transfers were what they look like, it's not just a civil matter. I hung up the phone, sat in the quiet of Barbara's kitchen. Outside, November rain moved across the window. I was afraid, and I was not going to stop. The call from Gerald Park's office came on a Tuesday in early December, 13 weeks after I had first sent those documents to Ruth. Gerald Park himself was on the line. Not an assistant, not a paralegal. He asked if I could come to his office the following day. He said the trustees' investigation had reached a significant point, and he wanted to discuss findings with me in person as a relevant party. I drove to Columbus alone. Ruth met me in the lobby of Park's building. We rode the elevator up without speaking. She had told me that morning to expect significant findings. She had not told me exactly what, because she said she wanted me to hear it in the room, in the proper context, rather than alone in a car on the highway. In the conference room, there were 4 people. Gerald Park, a woman from his staff, a man named Agent David Cho from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I sat down and looked at the papers in front of me and kept my hands still. What they had found was this: Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, Great Lakes Building Resources, Inc., and Consolidated Project Management Group had all been registered by a single attorney acting as nominee. That attorney had subsequently been contacted by federal investigators and had provided his client's name under a cooperation agreement. The client was Cheryl Collins. Over the course of 22 months, Cheryl had authorized transfers from Collins and Sons' operating account to her 3 shell companies, totaling $923,000. She had structured the payments to fall below federal reporting thresholds where possible. She had created and filed false invoices within the company's accounting system to document services that had never been rendered. She had done this methodically over nearly 2 years while her brother's company bled to death. I want to be precise about what that means in human terms. Donald had spent 41 years building Collins and Sons. He had started with 2 employees and a borrowed truck. He had built the warehouse on Route 40, the elementary school annex in Grover Township, the assisted living complex outside Millbrook that my friend Eleanor's mother had lived in for her last 3 years. He had built things that still stood. And his sister had sat in the accounting office and quietly dismantled all of it, payment by payment, invoice by invoice, across 22 months. The deficits she had created had made it impossible for Collins and Sons to meet payroll obligations during a difficult contract period, had torpedoed the company's credit rating, and had directly caused the bankruptcy. Donald had known something was wrong in the accounts in the final months. The documents showed he had confronted Cheryl in July. She had told him the irregularities were due to vendor payment errors that she was correcting. He had believed her. He had believed her right up until the filing. Of course he had. She was his sister. He had known her for 76 years. Some loyalties are longer than judgment. I sat in that conference room and listened to all of this with my hands flat on the table, and I did not cry. I had done my crying in October. What I felt now was something quieter and colder and more permanent. The specific grief of understanding something completely after it is too late to act on it differently. Agent Cho said that Cheryl would be receiving a federal criminal referral within the week. The charges would likely include wire fraud, bank fraud, and bankruptcy fraud, each carrying significant federal penalties. He thanked me for bringing the documents forward. I said, "Donald should have been the one to sit here." No one said anything for a moment. Then Gerald Park said quietly, "Yes, he should have." Ruth touched my arm briefly as we left the building. She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. I didn't plan to see Cheryl again, but she came to me. I had stopped at the grocery store in Millbrook on my way back from Columbus. A mechanical errand, something to do with my hands. The store was quiet at that hour. A Thursday afternoon, mostly retired people and mothers with strollers. The bread aisle smelled of something warm from the bakery at the back. I was looking at loaves without really seeing them when I heard footsteps and looked up. She must have seen my car in the parking lot. She walked toward me, and I did not move. There was nowhere to go, and more importantly, I had no desire to go anywhere. We had reached the end of something. Both of us knew it. Her composure, which she had maintained across every phone call and visit, had altered. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup hadn't fully covered. She had the look of a person who had not been sleeping. The careful coat, the set hair, all still present, but wearing thin, like a costume that no longer quite fit. "They came to my house," she said. Her voice was low. "Federal agents. Margaret, you don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I submitted financial documents to a bankruptcy trustee. The federal investigation that followed was their decision, not mine. "You destroyed this family." Her voice cracked. Not with grief, I thought, with fury at consequence. The fury of someone who had built something carefully and watched it fall. 49 years, and you couldn't leave it alone. You couldn't just let it. "Let it what?" I said. "Let it be buried? Let Donald be remembered as the man who ran his company into the ground through his own incompetence? Let $923,000 disappear and the people who were owed money get nothing? Let you—" I stopped, breathed. "Donald protected you until the end. He had that choice. I don't make the same one." She stared at me. I had the impression she was looking still for some opening, some softness, some flicker of the woman she'd counted on. An elderly schoolteacher. A wife who signed documents without reading them. A woman who had said ruined failure in a kitchen and then left. That woman, she had calculated, could be managed. She had miscalculated. The thing I remember most about that moment is how still I was. Not cold. I've been told I was cold, and I don't think that's accurate. I was clear. After months of confusion and fear and grief, I was simply and absolutely clear. Cheryl turned and walked away. Her heels on the linoleum, the fluorescent light of the bread aisle, the ordinary world continuing around us. An elderly woman in a grocery store, nobody watching. Nobody who would have guessed. I put a loaf of bread in my basket and went to the checkout. Then came the call from Donald's attorney. I had not spoken to Donald since I left. I had thought about calling him, had picked up the phone twice in November, set it down twice. I told myself I was waiting until the legal situation was clearer. The truth was more complicated, and I knew it, even as I told myself otherwise. I didn't know how to begin a conversation that started with, "I called you a ruined failure," and you nodded, and I have been unable to forget that nod. Some sentences don't have a good approach. You can only walk straight into them or not at all, and I had not yet found the courage to walk straight in. His attorney, a man named Philip Okafor, who had handled Donald's personal estate separately from the business, called me on a Wednesday morning in February. He said Donald Collins had passed away the previous day at Millbrook General Hospital. Cardiac arrest. He had been admitted 4 days prior. He said Donald had asked him to contact me. I drove to Philip Okafor's office on Friday. I don't remember the drive. I remember sitting in the parking lot for a while before going in. Long enough that a woman walking past glanced at me with brief concern. I nodded at her, and she moved on. I sat another few minutes, watching the ordinary street, a UPS truck double parked, a dog being walked by a teenager. Then I went inside. Philip was a careful man in his 60s, silver-haired, deliberate in his speech in a way that I found steadying. He offered condolences, which I received quietly. Then he said, "Your husband left specific instructions for this conversation. He knew in his last weeks what had been found by the federal investigation. He knew about your role in initiating the inquiry." A pause. "He wanted you to know that he was grateful." I said nothing. Philip continued. "He also wanted you to know that he had known about Cheryl's theft for approximately 4 months before the bankruptcy filing. He had confronted her in July, as you may have learned. She told him the money could be returned quietly, over time, without involving authorities. He—" Philip paused again. Chose his words carefully, the way men do when they're trying to be accurate about something painful. He agreed to try, not to protect himself. He believed that involving the law would destroy her. She had grandchildren. He had known her for 68 years. He couldn't do it. I thought about that for a moment. About the particular texture of Donald's loyalty. How deep it ran, how it had cost him, how it had ultimately been turned against him by the person who understood it best. He also wanted you to know, Philip said, that he had restructured his personal assets prior to the bankruptcy in a way that preserved certain accounts that were solely in his name, accounts the business bankruptcy could not reach. He did this with legal guidance before the filing, when he understood what was happening. He has left those accounts to you, and to Carol, and his sons David and Michael from his first marriage. Philip slid a document across the desk. The total value is approximately $340,000. I looked at the number for a long time. He protected you, I said finally, even then. He said to tell you. Philip looked at a handwritten note on his legal pad. He said, "She was right to be angry. She just didn't know what she was angry at." I pressed my hand flat on the desk and breathed. It was the most Donald sentence I had ever heard. Precise, generous, slightly deflecting. The sentence of a man who could absorb blame with more grace than he'd ever asked for credit. I had spent 49 years with him and hadn't fully seen that about him, and now I was sitting in a lawyer's office, seeing it for the first time with nowhere left to take it. How does a person carry that? Carefully, I suppose. One day at a time. The way you carry most things that can't be put down. Cheryl Collins was indicted by a federal grand jury in March on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of bank fraud, and 1 count of bankruptcy fraud. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial was scheduled for the following autumn. She did not come to Donald's funeral. Her son Brian attended briefly and stood in the back and did not approach me. He looked like a man who had recently realized something about himself and wasn't handling it well. I didn't speak to him. There was nothing useful to say. The house on Sycamore Drive was included in the bankruptcy estate and was sold. My share of the equity, after the home equity line was settled, came to $47,000. Combined with the inherited accounts, I was not wealthy, but I was not destitute. I was a 74-year-old woman with resources enough to begin again. I had not expected to be beginning again at 74, but there it was. Gerald Park's office, in the final report of the bankruptcy estate, noted that the fraudulent transfers, to the extent they could be recovered from seized assets, would be distributed to creditors. Several of Collins and Sons' former employees and subcontractors received partial payments. A man named Roy Hutchins, who had worked for Donald for 18 years, called me after he received his. He said he'd always known Donald was a good man. He said the Friday kolaches. He said the time Donald had driven an hour in a snowstorm to help him get his truck out of a ditch. Small details, the real fabric of a life. I thanked him, and we talked for a long time, and I wrote some of it down afterward, because I wanted to keep it. So did a man named Terrence Webb, who had worked on Donald's crew for 11 years and had been owed 3 months' wages when the company folded. He wrote, "I want you to know he was a good boss. I'm sorry for your loss." I kept both notes. I put them in the same folder as Donald's last message, the folded piece of paper from Philip Okafor's office. I never blamed her. I want her to know that. Philip had told me at the end of that meeting that this final line had been written separately from the rest. Added at the bottom of the page in handwriting slightly less steady than the lines above it, as if written later or in a different state. A thing decided upon. A thing chosen. I sat with that for a long time. In the parking lot. On the drive home. In the weeks that followed. He had been betrayed by his sister and abandoned by his wife in the worst year of his life, and his final recorded act had been to make sure I knew he didn't blame me. That is the thing I will carry longest. Not with guilt. Or not only with guilt. With something harder to name. A kind of reverence for the particular way some people move through the world, even when the world has not been kind to them. I moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Columbus in the spring. 3rd floor, south-facing, with a window over a small courtyard where someone had planted rose bushes that bloomed red in June. I had not lived alone since 1974. The first weeks were disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the silence, which I'd braced for, but the absence of accommodation. I no longer needed to account for another person's schedule, preferences, or moods. I ate dinner at 5 or at 8:30 depending on what I was doing. I rearranged the furniture 3 times in the first month because I could. Small freedoms, but they accumulated into something real. Carol came every other Sunday. We had grown closer in ways that the crisis had made possible, which is one of the strange gifts embedded in terrible things. She had always kept a certain careful distance from me, not unkind but protective of herself, in the way children of long, difficult marriages sometimes are. Now we talked plainly. About Donald. About my choices. About her own marriage that had ended 8 years prior, and which I had never fully understood until she explained it to me with the directness we'd both learned that year. I went back to the support group on Monday evenings. I began to facilitate, occasionally, when Janet asked me to. I was useful there in ways I hadn't expected. Old women in difficult situations sometimes needed to hear from someone who had been through it and was still standing, still clear-eyed, still capable of laughing. I laughed more than I had expected. In the summer, I took a trip. Something I had always deferred during the marriage because Donald didn't like to fly. 2 weeks in New England with Barbara, who had also never been. Maine, Vermont. The kind of landscape that makes you feel correctly small. I ate lobster in a shack on a dock in Portland and felt, with some surprise, something close to joy. I began writing. Nothing dramatic, a journal at first, then something longer, a kind of account. I'm not sure it will ever be read by anyone. But the act of writing it down, of putting the sequence of events in order and examining each one honestly, has been its own form of resolution. Cheryl Collins went to trial in October. Her defense argued that the vendor payments had been authorized by Donald Collins himself, and that any irregularities were the result of poor documentation, not fraud. The defense presented records showing Donald's signature on several of the authorization forms. The prosecution presented the testimony of the nominee attorney, who confirmed under oath that Cheryl had retained him to establish the LLCs and had directed their management. They presented email correspondence, recovered from company servers, in which Cheryl had coordinated invoice creation with an outside contact. They presented evidence that 2 of the 3 Shell Company bank accounts had been accessed via a device registered to Cheryl's home address. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in January. The federal judge, a woman in her late 50s who spoke in a deliberate, measured way that reminded me of Ruth, sentenced Cheryl Collins to 6 years in federal prison and ordered restitution of $923,000 to be paid from seized assets to the bankruptcy estate for distribution to creditors. She did not look at me during sentencing. I was present in the back row of the gallery, and she did not look at me once. Brian had testified for the defense, a character witness, speaking about his mother's commitment to family and her long service to the company. His testimony had not helped. He had lost his job the previous spring. He worked in financial services, and the publicity around his mother's indictment had made his position untenable. His wife had filed for divorce in August. I knew these things because small towns have long memories, and Carol kept me informed. I did not feel satisfaction about Brian's troubles. I felt something more neutral. He had made choices as his mother's instrument, and choices have consequences. That was not justice, exactly. It was just the way things tend to move. What I felt something closer to satisfaction about, quiet, private satisfaction, was the partial restitution paid to former Collins and Sons employees. Roy Hutchins sent me a note. So did a man named Terrence Webb, who had worked on Donald's crew for 11 years and had been owed 3 months' wages when the company folded. He wrote, "I want you to know he was a good boss. I'm sorry for your loss." I kept both notes. I put them in the same folder as Donald's last message, the folded piece of paper from Philip Okafor's office. I never blamed her. I want her to know that. Spring came again. The rose bushes outside my window bloomed a second time. I was 75. I had a daughter who called me regularly, a friend in Barbara, a community on Monday evenings, a journal I was slowly filling. I had the memory of a man who had, in the end, told me exactly what I needed to know. Not to exonerate me, but to release us both from something we might otherwise have carried indefinitely. That was enough. I was learning, slowly, imperfectly, genuinely, that enough is not a small thing. I have thought a lot about that moment in the kitchen. One sentence, and how much it cost. We don't always get to apologize to the people we hurt. We don't always get to know the full truth of someone else's story while they're still here to tell it. What I learned at 74 is this: cruelty spoken in fear is still cruelty. Silence carried out of love is still a kind of failure, and it is never too late to ask the right questions, even when the answers are hard. What would you have done? If this story reached something in you, I'd be glad to know. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you